November 14, 2025, 2:47 a.m. The Baltic Sea, winter cold pressing down on the Neva Bay. Somewhere in the darkness near Kronstadt Naval Base, a Russian Corvette sits anchored, crew sleeping, watch rotations running, on the comfortable assumption that no enemy could reach this far. 1,400 kilometers from the front, St. Petersburg harbor lights reflected in the black water, and closing silently through the chop, running on pre-programmed terminal approach profiles, two maritime UAVs about to deliver a message the Russian Baltic Fleet has never received before. The message: distance is no longer protection. What you're about to hear is not speculation. This is the documented, satellite-confirmed, open-source verified account of how Ukrainian GUR drone operators reached deep into Russia's northern naval heartland and struck a warship at anchor, forcing the entire Baltic Fleet into reactive defensive posture within 48 hours. Before this night is over, a Corvette will be listing at her dock, Russian state media will be in full denial, and Baltic Fleet commanders will be scrambling to rewrite their entire anchorage doctrine. This is the story of Operation Boiky. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we analyze the battles that change wars. To understand what happened on November 14th, you have to understand what the RFS Boiky actually meant to the Russian Navy. She was not simply a corvette. The Boiky, hull number 532, a Starogushki-class guided missile corvette, displacing roughly 2,100 tons, was one of the Baltic Fleet's newer prestige assets. Commissioned in 2013, she carried Kh-35 anti-ship missiles, a Kashtan close-in weapons system, and enough defensive electronics to make her commanders feel comfortable. She was the kind of vessel that gets scheduled for port review during a major state economic forum as a deliberate symbol of Russian naval power, operating normally, unbothered, beyond reach. The St. Petersburg International Economic Forum had been scheduled for the week of November 17, 2025. Putin's flagship annual showcase of Russian economic resilience despite Western sanctions. 3 days before the forum opened, Ukrainian GUR, Military Intelligence of Ukraine, chose that timing deliberately, not by accident. The strike on RFS Boiky was engineered to land at precisely the moment Russia most wanted to project stability. That choice tells you everything about how Ukraine fights this war. Which weapon system proved most decisive in this operation? Was it A, the maritime UAVs themselves, B, the satellite intelligence network that tracked the Boiky for months, or C, the electronic warfare countermeasure profile designed to defeat the ship's close-in defenses? Think about it. We'll come back to this, because the answer shapes how you understand modern naval warfare. Comment your answer below. The intelligence phase began in August 2025. 3 months of patient, methodical collection. Ukrainian GUR analysts were not working from a single source. They were fusing data streams from multiple origins simultaneously. Commercial satellite imagery from providers whose feeds Ukraine had learned to read with extraordinary precision. Signal intelligence intercepts that tracked the Boiky's communications patterns as she rotated between patrol assignments and port anchorages. Open-source maritime tracking data that, when combined with known Baltic Fleet operational rhythms, let analysts build a probability model of where the Corvette would be anchored on any given week in November. One detail from those 3 months that kept coming back in post-operation analysis. The Boiky had a pattern. She ran port rotations on roughly 18-day cycles, typically returning to the Kronstadt anchorage zone for maintenance periods of 4 to 7 days. The August to November window gave Ukrainian analysts 5 complete rotation cycles to observe. By October, they weren't guessing where she'd be. They were predicting it. That kind of certainty is not magic. It's what happens when you commit intelligence resources to a single target for 90 days and refuse to give up. But here is where the first major obstacle entered the picture. By late October 2025, the predicted anchorage window was confirmed. But the electronic warfare environment around Kronstadt had changed. Russian naval signals units, aware that Ukraine's drone capabilities were extending farther than expected, had quietly upgraded the EW coverage envelope around the Kronstadt base perimeter. The new profile wasn't classified. Careful analysts tracking Russian defense procurement had seen the equipment movements. But it meant the original terminal approach profile for the maritime UAVs was now almost certainly compromised. The jamming frequencies had shifted. The Ukrainian drone operators faced a choice: delay the operation and risk losing the optimal timing window before the economic forum, or redesign the approach profile from scratch with 30 days of margin. They chose redesign. Stay with me, because what happens in the next phase of this planning is where the operation crosses from ambitious to remarkable, and where the Russian crew of RFS Boiky moves from an assumption of safety into a catastrophe they never saw coming. The redesigned terminal approach relied on a principle Ukrainian drone engineers had been developing since mid-2025: sequential frequency hop programming combined with a decoy and striker pairing. Not a swarm, 2 drones. The first unit, call it Drone Alpha, carried a partially reduced warhead and a dedicated emissions package designed to trigger the Boiky's electronic countermeasures. Not to destroy, to force the ship's Kashtan system and its associated radar into active engagement mode, burning down sensor attention and electronic bandwidth on a threat that was real, but not the primary strike asset. Drone Bravo would follow 17 seconds behind Alpha's terminal run. 17 seconds, chosen because that interval placed Bravo inside the Kashtan system's engagement cycle dead zone, the period after initial target acquisition, when the close-in system's fire control is processing the first threat and has the narrowest window to re-queue a second engagement. Ukrainian drone engineers did not guess this interval. They had spent months studying Russian close-in weapons system documentation, some from open technical literature, some from captured equipment, some from combat observations in the Black Sea campaign. They knew the Kashtan's engagement parameters. They built the attack profile around those parameters' weaknesses. The thing is, this kind of operation wasn't supposed to work at 1,400 kilometers. When Ukraine launched its first maritime drone operations against the Black Sea Fleet in 2022 and 2023, analysts who understood the technical constraints of UAV range, navigation accuracy, and terminal guidance in contested electromagnetic environments would have told you that reaching Kronstadt was a bridge too far. The power requirements, the communication relay challenges, the GPS-denied navigation over hundreds of kilometers of open water with Russian jamming assets active across the approach corridor. What no one fully accounted for was that Ukraine had been systematically solving every one of those problems, one at a time, for 2 years. By November 2025, the maritime UAV program that reached RFS Boiky was not the same technology that had operated in the Black Sea. It had evolved. The power systems had been redesigned. The navigation stack used a hybrid approach, combining pre-programmed inertial guidance with sporadic burst communications through satellite relay nodes, positioned offshore in international waters. The terminal guidance used visual recognition algorithms cross-referenced against the target vessel's known profile, a system that worked even in GPS-degraded environments because it wasn't looking for GPS, it was looking for the ship. How many separate intelligence collection cycles did Ukrainian GUR complete before they were confident enough in the Boiky's position to launch? A 4 cycles, B 5 cycles, or C 6 cycles? Answer coming at the end. And the number matters because it tells you something critical about the patience required for this kind of deep strike operation. November 12, 2025, 2 days before the launch window. The drone operators received updated satellite imagery from a pass over the Kronstadt anchorage area. The Boiky was in position, but the imagery also showed something unexpected. A second vessel, a Gepard-class frigate, had moved into an anchorage position approximately 340 meters northeast of the Boiky's location. That second ship was not the target, but its presence changed the tactical geometry of the approach corridor. If Drone Alpha's decoy run attracted active radar engagement from both vessels simultaneously, the electromagnetic environment on approach to the Boiky's stern would be significantly denser than planned. And if the Gepard's crew identified the incoming drone as a weapon rather than a sensor anomaly and managed to transmit an alert, the Boiky might have an additional 40 to 60 seconds of warning, enough to potentially shift her defensive posture. The drone operators had 48 hours to decide whether to proceed, delay, or redesign. They proceeded, with one modification. The approach azimuth for both drones was shifted 7 degrees north, placing the final terminal run along a bearing that used the Boiky's own superstructure as a partial mask against the Gepard's radar systems. The math on this was tight. The margin for error on the approach bearing was roughly plus or minus 2 degrees before the masking geometry broke down. The operators held that line. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Not the sanitized version, not the propaganda version, but the actual tactical decision-making that happens when operators are choosing between risk profiles in the dark with imperfect information. November 14th, 2025. Launch window, 2:31 a.m. local time. The maritime UAVs were operating from a remote position in international waters, their precise launch platform deliberately not confirmed in Ukrainian official communications. What is confirmed by subsequent operational analysis and OSINT investigation is the timeline of what followed. At approximately 2:31 a.m., Drone Alpha entered its pre-programmed terminal approach sequence, running at low altitude, wavetop profile, designed to minimize radar signature against the cluttered sea surface return. It covered the final approach distance at a speed that allowed its onboard navigation system to continuously compare the visual horizon profile against the stored target recognition data, the Corvette's distinctive silhouette, the placement of her superstructure elements, the radar mast, the distinctive stern profile of a Staraguchi-1 hull. At 2:47 a.m., Drone Alpha crossed the electronic detection threshold of the Boiky's active radar systems. The Kashtan shoes lit up. Electronic countermeasures activated. The ship's duty watch, a skeleton crew on nighttime anchor watch, not full combat manning, began scrambling. Alarms, intercoms, the specific chaos of a vessel that believes it is under attack but cannot immediately confirm the threat class or count. 17 seconds later, Drone Bravo hit the stern section. The detonation was not catastrophic in the sense of a ship-sinking event. That was not the intent. A maritime drone carrying the warhead mass achievable at this range is not the equivalent of a heavyweight torpedo. What it produced was concentrated structural damage to the aft superstructure, the stern section housing auxiliary engineering spaces, crew berthing compartments, and critically, the mounting infrastructure for the ship's aft sensor array. Combat footage verification from sources that will not be identified in this narration to protect ongoing operational security shows a significant fire in the aft section within minutes of impact. Russian shipboard damage control parties responded. They did not lose the vessel. They were not meant to. Ukraine's maritime drone program long ago internalized a lesson that the most strategically valuable strike is not always the one that sinks the ship. Sometimes the most valuable strike is the one that forces the enemy to change behavior. Real tactics, real consequences. Steelfront. The initial Russian response to the strike was denial. State media outlets published nothing. TASS ran a brief item about routine Baltic Fleet exercises. On Russian naval forums, the semi-official enthusiast communities that have served as inadvertent intelligence windows throughout this war. Early posts suggesting something had happened at Kronstadt were deleted within hours. The denial lasted 41 hours. Then the satellite imagery reached the open-source analysts. Planet Labs commercial imagery captured in the morning hours of November 15th and November 16th showed the Boiky in her anchorage position with a visible list to port. Not dramatic, not capsizing, but unmistakable to anyone who knew the vessel's normal waterline profile. The aft section showed thermal signatures consistent with recent fire damage. Analysis by multiple independent OSINT organizations, including groups with strong track records of accuracy throughout the Ukraine conflict, confirmed what Ukrainian GUR had already publicly stated. The strike had occurred, the vessel was damaged, and the Russian denial was false. Here's what this tells us about the information warfare dimension of this conflict. Russia's capacity to suppress damaging news from a domestic audience was already under significant stress by late 2025. Commercial satellite imagery availability. The established OSINT community that had spent 3 years developing verification methods, and the speed of social media distribution meant that Russia's 41-hour suppression window was the best result they could achieve. In 2022, That suppression might have held for weeks. By November 2025, it couldn't survive 48 hours. Put yourself in the position of the Baltic Fleet commander, receiving his morning brief on November 15th. The Boiky is damaged. Russian state media is in denial mode. But he knows, because the satellite imagery is commercially available to anyone with a subscription, that the denial is a temporary fiction that will collapse. His immediate operational problem is not communications management. It is, if Ukraine can reach Kronstadt with a precision maritime strike, what else can they reach? And more pressingly, where are his other vessels? And are their anchorage positions predictable? The answer to that last question, he knew, was yes. Baltic Fleet operational patterns had been running on rhythms established over decades of Cold War and post-Cold War routine. Port rotations, maintenance cycles, exercise schedules, all of it conducted with the comfortable assumption that geographic distance from Ukraine provided operational security by default. That assumption died with the Boiky's aft superstructure on November 14th. If you believe tactics win wars, and specifically, if you believe that strategic reach changes the entire calculus of what's possible, type Steelfront in the comments. Because what happened next is the part that doesn't get enough attention in standard coverage of this operation. Within 48 hours of the strike, Baltic Fleet Command issued an internal review order covering all vessel anchorage positions across the fleet's operational area. This is not speculation. It was referenced in intercepted communications analyzed by Ukrainian intelligence and later partially confirmed through observable changes in vessel positioning captured by commercial satellite imagery over the following 2 weeks. 2 Karakurt-class missile corvettes scheduled for port rotation to the Kronstadt anchorage in the week of November 17-21st, the period directly overlapping with the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, were held at sea instead. Their scheduled maintenance windows were postponed. The reasoning was not stated explicitly in anything that reached open-source analysts, but it did not need to be. Predictable positioning at a fixed anchorage location, near a high-profile public event, with known coordinates that commercial satellite imagery had been documenting for months. That combination was now understood to be a targeting solution waiting to happen. Ukraine had not just struck a ship. Ukraine had made a dock a dangerous place to be. Here's the part of this operation that most coverage gets wrong, and it's worth being direct about it. The most significant outcome of the Boiky strike was not the physical damage to the vessel. The Boiky was damaged, not destroyed. She would require significant repair time. Ukrainian sources estimated 3 to 6 months of dock work minimum, based on the aft-section damage, visible in satellite imagery. But she was not a permanent loss to the Baltic Fleet's order of battle. The significant outcome was the behavioral change, the defensive crouch, the diversion of planning bandwidth from offensive or expeditionary thinking to protecting assets that had previously been assumed safe. And here is where the operation connects to the broader strategic picture, in a way that explains why GUR chose this target, at this time, in this manner. By November 2025, Crimea's logistics network was under sustained and increasingly effective Ukrainian pressure. HIMARS strikes, using the extended-range GMLRS ER munitions that had become available to Ukrainian forces earlier in 2025, had been systematically working through the Kerch Strait crossing infrastructure and the road and rail network feeding Russian forces in occupied southern Ukraine. The Black Sea Fleet, already having lost multiple major surface combatants to Ukrainian maritime drone operations since 2022, had effectively withdrawn most of its remaining surface assets to ports farther east, reducing their operational utility significantly. Russia's southern naval posture was already in a defensive crouch. What the Boiky strike achieved was extending that same posture to the northern theater, to the Baltic, where Russia's naval posture had remained essentially untouched throughout the conflict. Fleet commanders in the Baltic theater suddenly had to allocate planning and operational security resources to a threat environment that had simply not existed for them before November 14th. What would NATO have done differently in this situation? Set aside the obvious answer. NATO wouldn't be in this situation. And think about it tactically. Would a NATO maritime commander have varied his anchorage patterns more aggressively from the start? Would centralized EW coverage around naval bases have been different? Would the communication security that allowed Ukrainian intelligence to track the Boiky's rotation patterns for 3 months have been harder to achieve against a NATO standard signals security protocol? Comment your analysis below. There are real and interesting answers to each of those questions, and the best ones usually come from this community. The Boiky operation generated 2 specific doctrinal responses from the Russian side, worth examining in detail, because they tell you something about how military institutions absorb tactical shocks. The first response was the anchorage dispersion order we've already discussed. Fleet assets assigned to the Baltic theater began operating on less predictable rotation schedules, with anchorage positions varied more frequently and with less telegraphing of the maintenance cycles that had made the Boiky's position predictable. This was the correct tactical response, and it modestly increased the complexity of any future Ukrainian strike targeting Baltic Fleet assets. The second response was less rational and more revealing. Baltic Fleet Command requested an emergency review of close-in weapons system coverage for all major installations in the Kronstadt and Baltic areas. The review consumed planning bandwidth that had previously been allocated to conventional operational readiness activities. Russia's Baltic Fleet spent the weeks after the Boiky strike doing defensive architecture reviews rather than operational planning, reactive rather than proactive. Exactly the posture Ukraine had intended to impose. I spent time going through the available technical documentation on Starogushchi-class Corvette defensive systems, the open-source material, the naval architecture analyses, the combat system specifications, published in various forms over the years. One detail kept returning. The Kashtan Soyuz, for all its sophistication on paper, had a fundamental limitation that Ukraine had clearly identified and exploited. Its fire control system was optimized for single-threat engagement sequencing in an environment where threat axes were relatively constrained. The decoy-and-striker paired approach that Ukrainian drone engineers designed for this operation mapped almost perfectly onto the Kashtan's engagement cycle vulnerability. This wasn't luck. It was the product of a Ukrainian engineering culture that had been studying Russian naval defense systems with the specific intent of finding those vulnerabilities for years. The most surprising part of this operation, when you examine the full intelligence and engineering picture, isn't that Ukraine reached Kronstadt. It's how long and how carefully they prepared to do it correctly. 3 months of intelligence collection, 90 days of watching one ship move between patrol and anchorage. The decision to redesign the terminal approach profile from scratch when the EW environment changed, rather than accepting a degraded probability of success. The 48-hour deliberation over the approach geometry change, when the Gepard showed up in the anchorage zone 2 days before launch. This was not improvisation. This was the product of an institution that had learned, through 3 years of the most intensive operational environment in contemporary military history, that careful preparation is the prerequisite of successful execution. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. And increasingly, Ukraine invents new ways to plan. By December 2025, the open-source community had assembled a reasonably comprehensive picture of the Boiky's damage status. Satellite imagery analysis suggested the vessel had been moved to a covered maintenance facility, a covered berth that significantly reduced ongoing imagery analysis capability. Ukrainian military intelligence confirmed the vessel was out of operational service. Russian state sources continued to provide no official confirmation of the strike, which itself became a data point. The pattern of Russian non-confirmation had, by this point in the conflict, become well enough established that its application to any specific incident was read by experienced analysts as de facto confirmation. The strategic timing dimension deserves one more moment of examination. The St. Petersburg Economic Forum proceeded on schedule from November 17th through November 20th, 2025. Putin attended. Foreign business delegations attended, in reduced numbers compared to the pre-2022 era. The forum produced the usual announcements about Russian economic resilience and investment opportunity. And throughout those 4 days, in the covered maintenance berth where the Boiky sat with her damaged stern section, the ship was a reminder that the forum's atmosphere of normality was constructed rather than genuine. Ukraine had placed that reminder there deliberately. The timing was the message as much as the strike itself. One detail that stuck with me in reviewing the operational record of this strike: the Ukrainian GUR communique confirming the operation, released in the hours after Russian denial began to collapse under the weight of satellite imagery evidence, used language that was notably restrained. No exaggerated casualty claims, no dramatic declarations, just a precise description of what had occurred, what had been struck, and what the observable effects were. In a conflict saturated with information operations from both sides, that restraint was itself a form of communication. It said, "We don't need to exaggerate, the facts are sufficient." That approach, precise, evidence-based, willing to let observable results speak, has characterized the best Ukrainian military communications throughout this conflict. It is why, by late 2025, Ukrainian military statements had accumulated a track record of accuracy that Russian state communications had long since forfeited. Here's the take that will probably generate some pushback in the comments. The Boiky strike's most important lesson is not about maritime drones or EW countermeasures, or operational planning timelines. It's about institutional culture. Russia's Baltic Fleet commanders operated with a geographic complacency that was entirely predictable, given the assumptions embedded in their doctrine and operational culture. Those assumptions were not secret. They were visible in the regular, predictable, routine nature of the fleet's anchorage patterns over months of commercially available satellite observation. A more adaptable institution would have been randomizing those patterns as a baseline security measure, regardless of specific threat intelligence. The fact that it took a successful strike to force that randomization tells you something about how deeply the assumption of distance equals safety was embedded in Baltic Fleet culture. We'll say what most coverage won't. This wasn't primarily an intelligence failure. It was a cultural failure. And cultural failures of this kind are the hardest to reform, because they require an institution to acknowledge that its fundamental operating assumptions were wrong. The after-action assessment of the Boiky operation, as it emerged through Ukrainian official statements, OSINT analysis, and the observable behavioral changes in Baltic Fleet operations over the following weeks, pointed to several specific conclusions that matter for understanding how this conflict is evolving. Ukrainian maritime drone capability had, by November 2025, achieved genuine strategic reach, not just tactical reach into the Black Sea basin, established years earlier, but strategic reach into Russia's northern naval heartland. This was not a one-time improvisation. The engineering sophistication of the decoy-and-striker paired approach, the months-long intelligence collection cycle, the willingness to redesign the terminal approach profile from scratch when conditions changed. All of it pointed to a mature, institutionalized capability, with the organizational infrastructure to plan and execute complex deep-strike maritime operations repeatedly. The behavioral response from the Russian side, anchorage dispersion, rotation unpredictability, defensive architecture reviews, confirmed what the strike was intended to demonstrate: that geographic distance was no longer a reliable substitute for operational security. Every Russian naval asset, at any anchorage in any body of water with access to open maritime approach corridors, now had to be treated as potentially reachable. The resource cost of that defensive posture, sustained across every theater simultaneously, was not trivial. And the timing, the deliberate synchronization with Putin's economic forum, showed that Ukraine's drone warfare campaign had evolved beyond pure military targeting into a form of strategic communication. The message was addressed not just to Russian naval commanders, but to the international business community assembled in St. Petersburg. Russian power projection has limits. Those limits are being tested and found. The normality being performed in the forum halls exists alongside a damaged warship in a covered maintenance berth 3 kilometers away. Now, the answer to the quiz question from earlier. How many separate intelligence collection rotation cycles did Ukrainian GUR complete before they were confident enough in the Boiky's position to launch? The answer is B, 5 complete rotation cycles, observed from August through early November 2025. 4 would have provided a pattern. 6 would have pushed the launch window past the economic forum date. 5 was the minimum that gave analysts the statistical confidence to predict the anchorage position within the margin of error acceptable for a strike at this range. That number, 5, is the answer to a question about patience, about the willingness to wait when waiting means the difference between a strike that achieves strategic effect and a strike that merely makes noise. 5 cycles, 90 days, 2 drones, 1 message. Was the decision to launch against the tighter EW environment, rather than delay for better conditions, the right operational choice? The observable results suggest yes, but the margin for error in the approach geometry modification was tight enough that a different assessment is defensible. Could Baltic Fleet Command have prevented this strike with the information available to them before November 14th? The honest answer is, probably not completely, but they could have made the intelligence collection phase significantly harder had they been running less predictable anchorage patterns from the start. What would you have done differently as the Ukrainian mission planner, facing the unexpected presence of the Gepard frigate in the anchorage zone 48 hours before the launch window? Delay? Redesign the approach geometry as they did? Or something else? Drop your answer in the comments. We read all of them, and the best tactical analyses from this community are genuinely worth reading. Subscribe to Steelfront, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades, the kind of operations that look simple in retrospect, but required months of preparation, engineering innovation, and operational nerve to execute. This is what modern warfare actually looks like. Not the clean narrative of decisive engagements, but the patient, systematic, analytically rigorous campaign to find an enemy's assumptions and prove them wrong. Will Ukraine conduct a second strike against a Baltic Fleet asset in the next 12 months? Comment yes or no, and tell us which asset you think is next on the target list. The waters near Kronstadt naval base are quiet now. The covered maintenance berth holds what remains of the Boiky's damaged aft section, hidden from satellite imagery, awaiting repairs that Russian state media will never officially confirm are necessary. The Baltic Fleet continues its rotations, now on less predictable schedules, consuming operational planning bandwidth on defensive architecture that was not necessary before November 14, 2025. The damage remains. The behavioral changes remain. The lesson remains. In this war, no assumption of safety has survived contact with Ukrainian ingenuity for long. And the teams that reached 1,400 kilometers to deliver that message are already watching the next target. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. Steelfront.